Obviously, it was a tough day. I mentioned last week some of the intrepidation I had with some of our younger players. Some of that kind of proved to be true. It's so difficult, regardless of how you practice and all those other things that happen. It is a little camera problem there. It's so difficult to prepare them for those kind of situations. 92,000 people or whatever it held that day, and even though we try to do the best we can to simulate it in practice, we try to have those open scrimmages where there's people up in the stands. And I don't think we necessarily handled all that tremendously well. Some of our players didn't anyway, and some of them handled it extremely well. And so we found out an awful lot more about our football team, I think, as a whole. Obviously, I think Georgia is a very, very good football team. And I think it's one of the better teams that we've played since we've been here, and we've played against some very good teams. Tremendously impressed with their offensive line, their running backs, and then their defensive speed as a whole. But obviously we can play better also, and I think that's the challenge for our players is to step up and play better. I think that I think they're deserving of the ranking. I think probably not the discussion for today, but I think kind of moving forward, I think with some of the things that have happened over the last 4 or 5 years in recruiting, some of the rules that are applying now to the Power Five and in relation to the Group of Five, the whole Sun Belt Conference, especially against those teams that have separated themselves, those top 10, top 20 programs, didn't fare very well. And I think that gap is going to get bigger and bigger, quite honestly, as we're kind of moving forward, just because of some of the things that are allowed now that weren't allowed 4 years ago even. But again, that's a topic for another day, and now we need to move on and try to go back to work and get better. We did have some injuries that we hate for our young people as a whole. I still think this football team has got a chance to be the best football team that we've had since we've been here. I'm still anxious to see about our chemistry. I think one of the things that separated the 2012 team was the chemistry that group had, and I'm still anxious to see how that unfolds through the course of this season, because generally speaking, that's talent is going to take you so far, and then it kind of boils down to about the chemistry and that type of thing. And so still, in the early processes of trying to figure out how this team is going to react to different things. We practiced well yesterday. I expect to practice well again today. We've got an opponent this week that we know, quite honestly, very little about. Now, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Tim Rebowe, who's the new head coach there at Nicholls State. We worked together for a while. I know he's an outstanding football coach, and he's even a better person. They couldn't have hired someone better for that position. Again, have just tremendous respect for him. But there is those uncertainties now because of the fact this is their first ball game. And anytime that you get a new head coach, you know that there's going to be some changes in personnel and who they played last year. They have a significant number of transfers that have shown up on their two deep, as we saw today, along with some freshmen. And we'll do the best that we can to try to scout through that and try to, find some way to assimilate maybe some thought processes that they might have. But especially from a defensive perspective at this point in time, there's no coordinators in that group. I think Coach Rebowe is going to call the defense, and I know some of his thoughts in relation to past history, but I also know some of the things that maybe he's not very excited about. But that doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what he's going to do this week. And so this week it's going to be really, as it is every week, it's going to be about us, but we're going to have to kind of cover every front, every coverage, all those type of things, and then in game have to make adjustments, and which is a little bit more difficult, obviously, on a redshirt freshman quarterback, to have to kind of go through that whole process. Their offense, I think we have a little better idea because they do have a coordinator that has called plays before, and he came from Missouri State, and I'm assuming that they're going to do some things that were similar to what he'd done there, although he was working for a guy who I know very well, Terry Allen, at Missouri State, who was going to be very involved in the offense, and so there might be some changes there. And then from kicking game alignments to how they're going to kick off to what their punt formation is going to look like, we don't have any clue, and so we have to, again, be kind of prepared for anything and everything. And so there's going to be a huge mental challenge not just in getting over the past game, but in moving forward in terms of not knowing what we're going to get in this ball game. So, questions?
Yeah, going back to talking about how tough it is to prepare for these guys, and that's obvious with all the changes, but what exactly can you all do to get ready? What are some of the steps you have to take when there's not any film?
Well, I think you really focus on fundamentally trying to get better, because that's really about the only thing that you can do, and then trying to expose your players to an awful lot of different looks. And so we're really both sides of the football kind of taking, and I know this analogy is probably not great, but taking more of a wishbone approach to it, in the sense that if you're a wishbone team, you don't know what you're going to see each and every week, and so you basically just prepare for everything, and you touch on all the different things that you might possibly see. You're not going to get every play ran against that that defensive call or that offensive call, but at least they have some exposure to it, and then in game you start making adjustments. And so for us on Saturday, it's going to be all about in game, making those adjustments in game between series, at halftime, saying, okay, here's what we're getting. We're not even going to have any tendencies, obviously, in relation to, you might see it the first time. That doesn't mean you're going to see it the second time. And until we get a large enough database by halftime to really know exactly what they're doing, we're just going to have to adjust well, follow our rules, follow our blocking rules, follow our gap rules, and move on.
Sometimes after a loss like that, morale, how have the guys responded or bounced back from it?
Well, it's interesting, because I've talked with a few people in here about it. I don't think it was great, and that's probably a good thing, because that shows some expectation. When we first got here, one of my frustrations, quite honestly, and I voiced that at that point in time, and will continue to do so, was the fact that when we played those type of games, there was no frustration, and because there was no expectation. And 2012 kind of changed all that in relation to expectation. Now there's pitfalls with that too, obviously, in that the team trying to rebound from a loss like that, and we do have some high expectations. Obviously, that was a little bit more than we could bite off at this point in time, but I do think that some of the younger players that were a part of this past Saturday will have now got that first game experience out of the way, and we'll grow up and mature. And that's generally, you always hear the coach adage that in that second ball game, you tend to grow the most between the first and second, and I think that's true. The only problem with it is, generally speaking, the other team does too. And with this being Nicholls' first game, you're hopeful that they're going to have some of those first game jitters also, and that we will not have those jitters. But it's all about being 1-0 this week and turning our attention. We've got to get past the past, and we've got to focus on the future right now, and that's all that we can do and all that we should do. And that's part of, I think, one of the great learning experiences from being in athletics is good or bad. You have to put that one behind you and start focusing on the next one. And that needs to be our focus. I don't know that we were quite honestly over it yesterday. So I'm anxious to see how the team responds today.
Didn't show the two-quarterback system like you've had in the past, where the backup came in for a series. Mm-hmm. Was that just trying to keep Garrett's confidence high, or to kind of let him grind out the game speed?
Well, I think, again, early games, Georgia did some things different too. Just like we did. We did some things a little differently, and so you're trying to get a handle on exactly what is going on. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't play another quarterback, but quite honestly, I think that there in the second quarter, we started getting a pretty good handle on what they were doing on defense. And quite, again, I wanted Garrett to have those experiences, and Garrett was on a little bit of a roll at that point in time. And he's an interesting young man. There's an air about him that I really, really like. And, he took some hits, and he kept getting back up, and he kept on wanting more. And the more that we would talk on the sidelines, and the more that we were discussing that next series, the more excited you could tell he was getting about it. And I think there for a while we had a little bit of momentum. That opening drive there of the third quarter, right before the rain delay, I think that, or the lightning delay, I guess it was. We had a little thing going there, to where we were a little bit tough to stop at that point in time. That's why we left him in the game more than anything else. Now that we only had, the 55 snaps, I think, which is they had 52 snaps. I think we had 55, and that's not a lot of snaps in relation to what you would normally get in a ball game. The game was going by pretty fast, and then obviously with the delay at the end, or not the delay, the termination at the end of the game, they'd obviously cut some snaps out. But even at that rate that we were going at, we were probably, both of us, only going to get in that 60 range in terms of snaps rather than that normal 70 to 80 that we normally like to get. Now, we weren't quite as fast at tempo, and that was by design, partly for Garrett to get a little better look at what was going on, and partly to try to eat up a little bit of clock too, and try to keep the defense off the field some. And we won the time of possession, which was one of our goals kind of going in, even though the time of possession really doesn't it's not a great statistic anymore, as we've talked about before. But it was one of our goals, especially in the first half, was to try to have more time of possession.
Hey, Todd, we all know that a guy can go down on any game at any time of the year and that kind of stuff. And I know you were hoping that obviously you didn't have to start playing the Band-Aid game this early in the season, but has it been a distraction already this week in how to figure out what you're going to do with so many, few of your horses down already?
Well, you're right, Gene, in that injuries are going to happen, and they're going to happen sometimes without even contact. But it is those games tend to have a few more injuries, as has been documented before in relation to that type of game. And and Georgia's a physical team. They're a physical run group. They're physical on defense in the sense that they're going to put a lot of people close to the line of scrimmage. And anytime that you do that, you start creating piles. And sometimes in the piles, that's where you have some injuries. And so, would I choose a different opponent than Georgia? Sure, I would. I mean, I don't know that, again, there's 128 Division I-A teams, right? Georgia's number 9. And the rest of them nobody wants to play Georgia. The top 8 don't want to play them, and neither do the rest of them. And so, I would probably choose a different type of game, because I think it does give you a chance to start off a little better and maybe a little healthier.
Has it been a distraction here in these last few days, wondering where we're going to move guys around and get a little bit deeper and establishing some more depth in those spots?
It might for some of the younger players. I don't know that it does for the older players or for the coaches, in the sense that I think that it is part of the game, and you recognize that it's part of the game, and you just next man up and you move on. We hate it for those young men, obviously, because I know how hard that they've worked and prepared, and you want to see them. They don't have very long to live this dream of being a college athlete, and so you want them to have all the experiences, all those great experiences that they can have during this time frame. But injuries are a part of every game. Football, basketball, baseball, it doesn't make any difference, and sometimes life isn't fair, and that's life, and you just, you have to respond and move on and take what you have and move forward with it. And I think our players recognize that, and I think the injured players do too. And this is all part of it, and we hate it for them, but there's opportunities now to move on and with their rehab and get better and focus their attentions on some other things at this point in time.
Caesar had a huge game. Is that kind of what you've been seeing in practice the entire fall so far?
Yeah, it's amazing how those guys that that show up every day in practice, that have a skill level and a desire and knowledge base of what they're doing, how well they always perform. And Rashawn had a great preseason camp, so I was not surprised at all. And obviously, because he had a great preseason camp and there was some familiarity, I think, for Garrett with Rashawn, we focused significantly on Rashawn and getting him the football. And he showed up in a big way against a very, very good football team. But that's what good football players do, is they show up all the time, regardless of who they're playing. They show up. And Rashawn was obviously one of the bright spots, I think, from a team's perspective, is, he showed up. And then obviously Garrett, I mentioned it briefly early on, but I thought for a freshman to come in and complete 80% of his passes, even though they weren't all downfield passes, he threw some nice balls down the field also. And very, very excited about kind of how he played. You know, he had an early interception. I think he probably wished that he had that throw back in relation to the coverage that Georgia was in at the time. He probably could have had a little better ball placement, but overall his ball placement was outstanding. And the great thing is, you know, he threw an interception early and then he rallied up, and that's kind of what you'd like to see your quarterback do.
Starting at Nicholls, you think more people will be game planning to stop Rashawn, and of course maybe that'll open up other receivers who will have to step up their game.
Well, I think sure. Yeah, I think if they're smart, I mean, you've got to find a way to take Rashawn out of the game, and that's going to open up some more opportunities. You know, it happened last year between Rashawn and Jalen Holly, and that they were kind of going back and forth, being the leading receivers that week. And that's why I think offensively, you know, you have to be, if you're going to be dynamic in the passing game, you have to distribute the ball. And when you have opportunities present themselves, you've got to step up and make plays. And you know, I like our receiver group right now. I wish we had a little bit more depth right now than what we have. We had some young men that didn't practice as well as what we'd like to have seen them practice last week, and they didn't play. And that's also life. You know, if you don't prepare well, then you're probably not going to have opportunities. And they didn't, and so I'm anxious to see how they respond this week in practice, because I think, you know, obviously they recognize that just because you're second on the depth chart doesn't necessarily mean that you're second onto the field. You know, there's other options along those lines.
I know you can't. The offense. You mentioned after the game the other day that you would have liked to run the ball more and to do some more in that area. Is that something that could be a focal point this week? Get ready to go into Nicholls, is getting that run game going.
Well, I would have liked to have thought that we could have run the ball better than what we did. Now, Georgia had an awful lot to do with that because they were always going to overload the box. We kind of knew that about their defensive coordinator. They were always going to have an extra hat in the box. We tried to do some things, and to some effectiveness, actually, and especially against a team like Georgia, which we haven't had success running the football at all. And even though statistically, you know, we didn't average a great yardage, some of that can be attributed to the sacks, those lost yardage plays. But you know, we actually creased them a few times in the running game, and I was hoping that with a little bit of the mirage of what we're doing offensively right now, with some of the things that we are doing, that we could create a few more opportunities in there and take a little bit more pressure off of Garrett. I'd like to see our running backs. I've challenged our running backs. I thought we were breaking our feet way too much, and you can't do that against a good football team. You've got to get downhill and just throw your body through a crease. Garrett was doing that probably better than anybody, and so consequently Garrett had a few more runs than what we'd actually planned on him having, but he was actually attacking downhill and throwing his body through a crease. And I think this next week, I think our running backs, you know, had that opportunity to kind of see that, and I think we'll see a little difference out of them this week. I didn't answer your question, did I?
No,
Did you like the way I do? Did you like the way I kind of ran around that?
That was real sly of you. I applaud that.
Do I? Well, I did it. I did admit it. We'll see. You know, I don't really go into any game with any kind of preconceived notion that this is going to be a run game or this is going to be a pass game, or that we're looking for balance. What you'd love to have is you'd like to have balance at the end of the year, because if you've had balance at the end of the year, that means that those teams that came up and lined up and said, you know what, you've got to throw it every snap, you threw it really well, and so that next team comes up and says, well, we've got to stop the pass, and then you run it really well. And then there's that back and forth that goes on, but you know, so we don't look at each game and say this is what we need to do. We look at each game and saying this is what we're going to take advantage of what the defense gives us. And then at the end of this season, that's when you hope that you've established some balance.
Coach, one of the themes of the opening weekend was obviously your game ended with the weather.
Right.
Starting and stopping. Just some problems and complications with starting a game, stopping a game due to weather.
Well, it's something that I think we're going to have to deal with more in college athletics now because of the policies that are in place. There's some accuracy now in relation to, you know, where the lightning was hitting. You know, that first lightning delay, I didn't know what actually was going on because I couldn't hear down on the field until the official came over and told me exactly what was happening. And you probably saw me on the sideline. I saw, you know, Coach Rick send his team in, and so then I was like, okay, what is going on? Because, you know, there wasn't any threatening weather. It didn't look like in around us. But there was obviously in the area, and I'm not against it necessarily. It's going to be something that we're going to have to get acclimated to. Now, I was a little bit surprised in the second one when Coach Rick, the athletic director, started kind of coming across the field. We don't have this in the Sun Belt, to my knowledge anyway, but they have a policy in place in the Southeastern Conference, and they were actually showing it to me in their policy manual about a termination of a game in the fourth quarter if there's a second delay. And I guess actually it's even larger than that because they were reading it all to me. And the one that applied obviously was the second termination in the fourth quarter, which was what was applicable to us. So because it was a non-conference game, they were basically saying we don't have to basically abide by this, but we would prefer to in relation to how we handle things in the Southeastern Conference. And at that point in time in the game, the reality of it was we were probably, I mean, they were going to run the football and run out the clock, and we were going to do the same thing. And with 8 minutes left to go, assuming that nobody's calling timeouts and that everybody's staying in bounds and all that, there was going to be one possession, maybe two possessions left, and it was going to be all of our down-the-liners on both sides. And I don't know that there would have been much value in that other than just getting us all home later than what we were already going to get home. And Coach Richt was kind of in agreement on that. He'd had enough, and we kind of agreed at that point in time, and the athletic directors did too, that the game should just go ahead and we should follow the SEC policy and just terminate it at that point in time.
Hey, Todd, you only have 5 home games, so obviously they're all important to get W's, but this would be kind of one of those situations where you really feel like, not to press the issue too much, but it'd be nice to get out of here with one, and want to be sure you take care of business to make sure it happens.
Yeah, regardless of where it is, you're right in the sense that this is the next one, and we need to be 1-0 this week. A good win cures everything, always does, and a bad loss always it overemphasizes some things that maybe don't need to be overemphasized, and you deal in, I think, in reality sometimes a little bit better when there's a little bit larger database to be able to understand exactly where you're at. But you're right. I kind of challenged the team early in the season. I think this is outside of what happened with Tulane a few years ago. This is a record number of away games for any NCAA team this year. Because we have 8, and I think that's the most in the history of NCAA football outside of those special situations like Tulane had. And so we're going to have to play great on the road, but we need to play great at home too. And so bottom line is, you've kind of, defend the home turf, be road warriors. What you need to do is you need to play well all the time. And that's what we need to do, and that needs to be our focal point is regardless of where it's at, and is we need to play to our standard each time. And don't know that we actually, did that. I think that, obviously the kicking game was a struggle. The field position, their average starting field position was the 50, ours was the 17. You're not going to win a lot of ball games whenever you're doing that, and obviously the kicking game played a part in that. The lack of offensive production early on in terms of gaining some first downs played a part in that. And then quite honestly, defensively, we need to, this should be the strength right now, and giving up 8 yards per play, that's not what I expected out of our defense. And and that would just kind of came down to gap responsibilities. I think our hearts are right on defense, but we've got to play better than what we played the other day. But we were playing against a good football team, but we've played against good football teams before and good running teams, and for them to kind of pile up that kind of yardage on us was, even though it wasn't over the top in relation to total offense, when you start looking at 8 yards per play, that's a little disconcerting.
Brian Wickstrom's been kind of mum on the alternative jerseys for this weekend. You care to share a little light on the subject?
I've been pretty mum about that also. No, I mean, I think, I think the fans and I think their players will get a kick out of it. I'm not real big into all that stuff, as I've said before, but I mean, if everybody else gets into it, then that's great. So they're unique. There will be some uniqueness about them.
You say that, but that's a good-looking polo you got on there.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, this is, I think, a couple years old. As the equipment people will always tell you, I've got all these things in my locker that have tags on them. I don't know when this one came out, but I tend to kind of wear stuff out, and then once it's worn out, then I'll grab something else rather than just putting new stuff on.
With Nicholls not having a lot of experience defensively, do you guys feel it's more of an advantage for you guys?
Well, you hope that because we have a game underneath our belt that there is some advantage to that, because I think we know now a little bit about kind of who performs well in those kind of environments, and our team has a chance to kind of grow up and mature a little bit more, and so yeah, I think there is some value to that. But sometimes it's also good to know exactly what you're getting ready to see. And I'll give you an example, 2012 Georgia, or probably Arkansas. 2012 Arkansas, they'd already played a game. We hadn't. And we had a chance to kind of see what they were going to do at that point in time. So bottom line is we need to show up and play and not count on any kind of, prescribed advantages or any of those other kinds of things. We need to show up and play. I know that they'll do the same and try to show up and play, and obviously this is a big game for them, and so I'm sure they're going to be emotional about that opportunity to play us, and we should be emotional about that opportunity to play them also.